Today, we're breaking down the top 10 DnB drum patterns. All in audio this time by popular demand. These patterns are fundamental to drum and bass and beyond, so use them even if you don't produce drum and bass. Alright, let's dive in and level up your drum game. Alright, before we start, since we're doing drum and bass, my BPM is set to 175 beats per minute. Usually drum and bass ranges from 170 all the way to 175, even up to 180 beats per minute and down to 160, depending on the vibe of your track. And we're going to be recreating each drum kit with 3 essential hits, which can be found in pretty much any drum pattern. That's the kick, snare, and hi-hat. Simply by using these 3 hits, you can create a multitude of rhythms and patterns. In some sections, we'll also be using a ghost snare, and I'll explain how we'll use that later on. So let's start with one of the most basic and most popular patterns in drum and bass, the 2-step pattern. Now, since we're doing this in audio, make sure you have 1 bar selected here and that your grid is set to an 8th note. So it splits your grid into 8 individual pieces. The easiest way to start is with the hi-hats. So taking the hi-hat, we can duplicate this 8 times across like this. And then we have a kick at the very beginning of the bar, followed by a snare here and a snare here. And this is why we call this the 2-step break. If you change it to the quarter notes, you'll see that there's 4 sections here. Each of these sections are called a beat. And with the 2-step pattern, you have a snare on the beat 2 and beat 4. Now to complete the 2-step pattern, let's add a kick over here. And now we have this. Here's some variations of the 2-step pattern. If we switch it to the 16th note grid, by the way, you can switch the grid by holding Control or Command 1 and 2. That makes it bigger and smaller. Now with the 16th note grid, we can place hits in between these 8th note positions. So this pattern, I call the 2-step bounce. Notice how that kick in the middle creates a bouncing rhythm. It's a very common pattern used in jump up drum and bass. Here's another variation. Shorten that middle kick, add a fade, and add one here. I call this the double bounce. This was a common pattern in early neurofunk in the 2000s by artists such as Noisia. Now going back to the basic 2-step pattern, you can put a kick over here. I call this the kickback pattern. And this is also a common pattern found in hip hop and pop music. Here's some other kick variations. You can put a kick at the very end like that. Or you can have a double kick in the beginning. Here's another one with the double kick over here. Remember the kickback pattern we had here? We can move this kick over here. And I've heard this pattern in some Neuro tracks. You can also remove this kick here. That's found in Neuro as well, or over here. Over here. And over here. All right, let's take that basic 2-step pattern we had originally. And let's look at some 2-bar variations. We can take this section here and duplicate it twice. And now you have this. I call this the vessel break after the track Vessel by Universal Project on Virus Recordings. Now, these are only fundamental patterns, so try to think outside the box and play with different variations that I may not even have spoken about. You can add a double kick here. You can even add a bounce kick in between these guys. The sky is the limit. Here's a pattern I hear a lot in modern jump up. Remove all these kicks. We just have 1 kick here and 1 kick here. All these patterns here are variations of the drum and bass 2-step. By the way, if you're looking for sample packs, preset packs, or Ableton kits to help you along your drum and bass journey, you can check out my shop at deviantaudio.com or down in the links below. For bass sounds, the Gnarly Volume 1 and 2 Serum preset packs have been super popular. And then for drum and bass and jungle breakbeats, you can check out the OG Jungle sample pack, the Acid Lab sample pack, as well as the fragments and hybrid breaks sample packs. I also have Ableton kits that make creating drum and bass super easy. You can check out the Jungle Kit, Liquid Kit, as well as the Rollers and Rough and Rugged kits. And for those who want to get super equipped, you can get the Deviant Audio Production Kit, which contains all 12 of our previously released kits at 50% off. This excludes Gnarly Volume 2. Learn more down in the links below. The next pattern is another variation of the two-step pattern, but it's so unique I think it deserves its own section. I call it the delayed two-step. Simply, we have the two-step break here, move the snare over here. The first time I've ever heard this used was by the producer dBridge. Now, because this pattern has a delayed snare, it almost feels like it never resolves itself. So one trick producers use to resolve this pattern is to duplicate the pattern. So now we have 2 bars, and at the second bar, we move the snare back. And then we have this. I've even heard some tracks where they extend this to 4 bars, and at the 4th bar, they resolve that snare. The next pattern is the second most popular pattern in drum and bass, which I call the Steppa pattern. So going back to our basic two-step pattern, the Steppa pattern, we simply remove this kick and move the snare over here. And this is found in a lot of steppy drum and bass and jungle. Now, to make this pattern more involved, we use what we call a ghost snare, which is typically a snare that hits a bit quieter or a bit lighter. So I have a ghost snare or ghost hit here, and we simply put it in the in-between spots in the 16th note positions over here and here. So now what we have in this section is a shuffle. Anytime you have a hi-hat and a ghost playing really quickly in a 16th note pattern, it's called a shuffle. And we can repeat that here as well. The next pattern is a cousin of the Steppa. I call it the Stompa. Now, playing the original Steppa pattern we have here, let's remove these ghost notes. And to create the Stompa, we simply have a kick here and a kick here. So we get this boom, boom, boom. I call it the fake triplet pattern or dotted quarter notes. Notice that thumping vibe. That's why I call it the Stompa. Sometimes this third kick is omitted. And then we can fill in this gap with a shuffle. A very common pattern in jungle. Finally, we can move this kick over here. I call this the Waterhouse pattern, after the track Waterhouse Dub by Digital. You can also add a double kick on the Waterhouse pattern. Lots of variations. All right, the next very important pattern is called the dancehall pattern. So remember the Stompa pattern we had here. Let's remove these snares, and now we have the basic dancehall pattern. Here's some variations of the dancehall pattern. We can remove this kick here, replace it with a snare. Or we can remove this kick and add a snare here. Finally, replace this kick, replace it with a snare. Now we don't have any kicks. And then you can add ghost hits to create shuffles in between. And I call this the 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗙𝗢𝗪 pattern. The next pattern has been popular in more modern drum and bass. I call it the Dimension UK pattern, based off the track by Dimension. So here's the basic two-step pattern we had earlier. And the Dimension UK pattern is 2 bars. So extend the hi-hats, and simply we take the snare and duplicate it on every quarter note. Now, to make it a little more interesting, we can remove this final snare here, add a ghost shuffle over here, and then a kick at the end. This kick could also be a snare, like this. Very fun pattern. You usually complement this with a 4/4 bass pattern. By the way, I noticed that over 50% of you have not subscribed. If you guys enjoy receiving free content like this, it's super easy to support and doesn't cost a cent. All you have to do is hit the subscribe button. Thanks. Next pattern, we have the extended Steppa pattern. And this pattern was used a lot, especially in the middle 2000s by artists such as 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗡𝗙. I've used it a lot in my tracks as well. So to create the extended Steppa pattern, start with the basic Steppa pattern. And then extend your section to 2 bars and take this very last 3 hits here and duplicate like that and just remove the very last section here. So we have a perfect 2 bar. Now sometimes this ghost hit at the end can be omitted. Here's a variation of the extended Steppa, which I call the double kick extended Steppa. To create this pattern, we need a double kick at the quarter note positions. So we need space to create that kick. So to do this, take the snare section to the end and move the snare 1 beat forward. Now take the kick section and the hi-hats and duplicate it, and then remove this section over here that's not needed because it's beyond your 2 bars. Now we have a perfect 2 bar, and this is what we have. All right, onto the halftime pattern. Sometimes we call it the drum step pattern. Taking the 2-step pattern, remove the second snare, and this snare is placed over here on the 3rd beat. Now the halftime pattern is influenced by hip hop, so sometimes we have additional kicks. So you could have a kick here. More commonly, we have a kick here. And sometimes a kick even here. I've heard this used a lot in the 2000s by artists such as 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗡. Now taking the halftime pattern, we can make it more like drum step by adding ghost notes. So we can add a ghost shuffle here and here. As well, we could have a shuffle here and even here. Now the halftime pattern is more interesting when you extend it beyond 1 bar. So let's take the first bar, duplicate it. Now we have 2 bars. Now instead of having a repetitive pattern like this, we can create a little more groove and syncopation by removing the first kick of the 2nd bar. And then we can move this kick here. Let's remove this kick. Now, if you take out this kick and this, you have a halftime 2-step pattern. And I'll let you guys imagine all the variations you can create with that. Here's one you can do. You can simulate the shuffle using main snares like that. Fun stuff. The next pattern is called the footwork pattern, named after the genre of footwork and footwork jungle. And to learn the footwork pattern, it's important to understand the dotted 8th note. So if we go back to the 8th note grid, remember this is the size of an 8th note. So a dotted 8th note simply means the size of an 8th note plus half this size here. And simply taking this kick, we can repeat this like that. And then taking this section, sometimes we call this a fake triplet because it repeats itself from here. But since this 3rd note is shortened, meaning there's no space before the next hit, that's why we call it a fake triplet. Now to make this a little more interesting, sometimes we put the snare on the half time position, which is beat 3 over here. Or sometimes we have a snare here and here, like the 2-step pattern. This pattern is a little more experimental, and you can try different patterns that we may not have spoken about. For example, you can remove these kicks here and place the snare here. This is almost like a double time dancehall rhythm. Let's try taking these kicks and replacing it with a snare. Another variation of the footwork pattern is taking that dotted 8th note and just duplicating it all the way across. So now we have this. Oftentimes, we remove this last kick or just put the kick over here. Now going back to the original footwork kick pattern, let's remove this kick here and move this kick here. I call this the reggaeton pattern based off the reggaeton genre. Going back to the footwork pattern, remember this one with 1 kick and 4 snares. If we take the snare and move it to the second beat here, I've heard this in some drum and bass as well. Alright, the next pattern is super fun. I call it the triplet 2-step pattern. So here's the basic 2-step pattern. Now, in order to get true triplets, you're going to have to change the grid to triplet mode. So right click and choose triplet grid. Now, if we make this a bit wider, you'll see that each beat is split into 3 sections instead of 4. The first step of the triplet pattern is to make the hi-hats fit the triplet grid. So remove your hi-hats and resize this hi-hat to a triplet size and then duplicate it all the way across. Now, we're not done yet. This kick here just doesn't sound right because it's not falling on the triplet grid. So to correct this, let's move this over here. Much better. To make this funkier, sometimes we have a kick over here. You could also have a kick here. And let's try a kick over here. Maybe even over here. Lots of different patterns, but going to the hi-hats, sometimes you may not want a fast hi-hat like that. So you can remove hi-hats like that. So now we have this. To make it more funkier, we can add this hi-hat back. Experiment and try different hi-hat positions. One notable track that used this pattern back in the day was Shimon and Andy C's Body Rock. Here's some bonus patterns. I don't really have a name for this one, but first time I think I've heard this was by an artist duo named Steppa and Skynet. Remember that dotted 8th note pattern we were using in the footnote? Simply move this snare here and alternate between kick and snares. So we have a kick over here, and then the next dotted 8th note would be here, and then over here, like that. It's a fun pattern once you add some bass. Here's one addition to the dancehall pattern. Remember this basic pattern here? If we place a kick over here on the 3rd beat, we have the moombahton or reggaeton beat. Hope you guys enjoyed learning the 10 fundamental drum patterns in DnB and beyond. Once you learn the fundamentals here, go beyond, expand, and explore into other patterns and drum positions. Remember, it's all about exploring and learning different patterns. The more patterns you learn, the more versatile you become as a producer. Even if you don't make drum and bass, it's important to learn these patterns, and you can use this across various genres and BPMs. And once you've mastered these patterns and you're ready to take it to the next level, you can get more in depth with drum programming with this playlist up here. And then you can learn about adding bass to your drums with this playlist up here. Alright guys, thanks for watching and see you at the next video. Peace.